The rain was a soft, steady whisper against the glass of the study window, a sound that usually calmed Liam, but tonight it only amplified the frantic beat of his own heart. His back was pressed against the hard spines of 100 novels, each one a story of love or betrayal, but none as sharp, as real as this. Isabella's hands were flat against his chest, her touch a brand through the thin cotton of his shirt. "Isabella, please. We can't keep doing this," he breathed out, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the quiet creak of the old house settling. Every sound was a reminder of the life he was betraying, just one floor above. She's just upstairs. Alara, his wife. The thought was a shard of ice in his gut. But Isabella only smiled, a slow, knowing curve of her lips in the dim light. She leaned closer, her own breath, a warm, intoxicating cloud of wine and want. "Shh, Liam," she murmured, her voice a velvet caress against his ear. "She's sleeping. She doesn't dream of this. She doesn't know." Her fingers traced the line of his collarbone, sending a tremor through him that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a desire so profound it felt like drowning. "Only we know how much you want this." His protest, already weak, died in his throat as her mouth found his. For a single, fleeting moment he resisted, his hands coming up to push her away, but they faltered, his fingers instead tangling in the silk of her dark hair, pulling her closer. A low groan escaped him, a sound of complete and utter surrender, as the quiet of the night swallowed his sin whole. This devastating storm, however, had started as a gentle summer breeze, just 3 months earlier. It began in a house of glass and clean lines, nestled in the green, manicured heart of Connecticut. Here lived Alara, a brilliant architect whose mind was a beautiful cathedral of blueprints and ambition, leaving little room for anything else. And here lived Liam, her husband, a novelist who crafted worlds with words but felt increasingly lost in his own. Their son Leo was the bright sun they both orbited, yet they were moving in different galaxies. The silence in their perfect home had grown louder than any argument, a vast, echoing space between his lonely days and her exhausting nights. So, they made a practical decision, the kind of logical choice people make when avoiding the real emotional problem. They decided to hire an au pair, a helping hand for Leo, a bridge for the gap that had grown between them. And then, she arrived, Isabella, from Spain. A beautiful, vibrant answer to a prayer they didn't even know they were whispering. She was supposed to be a solution. She was supposed to fix the cracks. They never imagined she would become the tremor that brought the whole house down. It was the kind of mid-June day in Connecticut that felt heavy, the air thick with the sweet, cloying scent of honeysuckle and the promise of a thunderstorm that never quite broke. The sky was a pale, hazy blue, and the sun beat down on the perfectly manicured lawn of Liam and Alara's home, making the blades of grass stand stiff and thirsty. Their house was a masterpiece of modern design, a structure of glass and white stone that Alara herself had conceived. It was featured in magazines, a testament to her talent, with clean lines and vast windows that stared out into the lush woods like unblinking eyes. But to Liam, the house had started to feel less like a home and more like a beautiful, sterile museum where he was the loneliest exhibit. He was in his study, a room walled with the books of other, more successful writers, staring at a cursor blinking on a white screen. The words wouldn't come. They hadn't, not really, for months. He was a ghost in his own life, haunting the quiet hallways, while Alara, his vibrant, brilliant Alara, was a voice on a conference call, a blur of motion in the morning, the faint scent of her expensive perfume on a pillowcase when he finally came to bed. He heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway first. It was a foreign sound in their secluded world, where the only visitors were delivery trucks or Alara's important clients. He stood up, drawn to the window that overlooked the front of the house. A yellow taxi, looking impossibly bright against the muted greens and grays of their landscape, had pulled up to the curb. The back door opened and a leg emerged, slender and tan, followed by the rest of her. Isabella, the new au pair. Liam felt something shift in the air, a subtle change in pressure, the way the atmosphere drops just before the lightning strikes. She was just standing there, paying the driver, a simple suitcase at her feet, but the stillness of the afternoon seemed to bend around her. She wore a plain, lemon-yellow sundress, the kind of simple garment that should have been unremarkable, yet on her, it seemed to hold the very essence of summer. It fell to just above her knees, and the humid air made the soft cotton cling just enough to hint at the graceful lines of her body, the gentle curve of her waist, the subtle swell of her hips. Her hair was the first thing that truly snared his attention. It wasn't black, it was the color of wet ink, a cascade of dark silk that tumbled over her bare shoulders, so stark and beautiful against the pale yellow of her dress. He found himself moving, walking out of his study and towards the front door, before he had even made a conscious decision to do so. He opened it just as she was raising her hand to knock. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Up close, she was even more striking. Her eyes, he noticed, were not just brown, but the color of warm honey held up to the light, and they were framed by thick, dark lashes. They were intelligent eyes, observant, and then she smiled, and Liam felt the full force of it, a genuine, unpracticed smile that seemed to start in her eyes and spread across her face, showing a row of perfect white teeth. It wasn't just a smile, it felt like an offering, a small piece of warmth gifted just to him. "You must be Liam," she said, her voice soft, with the melodic, rolling accent of her native Spain. "I am Isabella." He managed to find his own voice, clearing his throat. "Yes. Welcome. We're so glad you're here." He reached for her suitcase, and their fingers brushed. A spark, small and insignificant, but he felt it, a jolt of warmth that traveled up his arm. He told himself it was just static, the heat of the day, anything but what it was. Just then, Alara appeared at the top of the grand floating staircase, her phone still pressed to her ear. "Okay, send me the revised schematics by 4. I'll review them tonight. Ciao." She clicked off, her face instantly shifting from the sharp, focused mask of the architect to the polite, welcoming face of the hostess. "Isabella, you made it, I'm Alara." She descended the stairs, her movements efficient and graceful. She was beautiful, my wife, in that polished, powerful way. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a sleek knot, and her linen suit was immaculate despite the heat. She shook Isabella's hand, her gaze quick and appraising, the way she might inspect a contractor's work. It wasn't cold, not exactly, but it was a world away from the unguarded warmth Liam had just witnessed. "We're so happy to have you," Alara said, her smile perfectly pleasant. "Leo has been asking about the new friend from Spain all morning." As if on cue, their son, Leo, peeked out from behind Liam's legs, his small face a mixture of curiosity and shyness. This was the moment that Liam would replay in his mind countless times in the months to come. This was the moment she truly arrived. Isabella's entire focus shifted to the little boy. The bright, confident woman who had charmed him and impressed Alara seemed to melt away, replaced by someone softer, gentler. She crouched down, bringing herself to Leo's level, the yellow fabric of her dress pooling around her. She didn't try to touch him or force an interaction. She simply waited, her honey-colored eyes full of a quiet kindness. "Hola, Leo," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Me llamo Isabella." She pulled a small, carved wooden bowl from the pocket of her dress and placed it on the floor between them. "I brought you a friend from my home." Leo stared at the toy, then back up at her face. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, before picking up the little bowl. He looked at her, and for the first time, he offered a shy smile of his own. In that instant, watching her connect so effortlessly with his son, Liam felt a pang in his chest, a complex cocktail of gratitude and something else, something deeper and more dangerous. He saw a maternal warmth, an unhurried tenderness that he felt had been missing, lost somewhere between Alara's deadlines and his own quiet despair. She was perfect, too perfect. A fresh breeze in their stale, air-conditioned life. He watched her as Alara showed her up the stairs to her room, the sway of her hips, the bare skin of her back. And when they were gone, he stood alone in the vast, silent entryway, the cool marble beneath his feet feeling colder than ever. The house was no longer empty. It was full of a new and terrifying possibility. The storm hadn't broken outside, but inside, Liam knew the first drops of rain had already begun to fall. The first few weeks passed in a blur of deceptive domestic tranquility. Isabella moved through the house not like an employee, but like a missing piece of the puzzle they hadn't known was lost. She was a ghost of perfect efficiency, tidying up messes before they were even noticed, charming Leo with stories in Spanish that made him giggle, and maintaining a respectful, almost invisible presence. She learned the rhythms of the house quickly, the most important of which was the rhythm of Alara's absence and Liam's solitude. She was an observer, quiet and astute. She saw the way Alara would kiss the air near Liam's cheek in the morning, a gesture of a wife performed by a business partner. She saw the way Liam's shoulders slumped the moment he heard the crunch of Alara's car pulling away down the long driveway. She saw the takeout containers that piled up on the nights Alara worked late, evidence of meals eaten without conversation, without connection. She didn't just see the cracks in their perfect facade, she studied them, understood their depth, and learned their shape. The true shift, the first deliberate turning of the key, happened on a Tuesday. Alara had called, her voice tinny and distant through the speakerphone, to say she was stuck in a client meeting in the city. It wouldn't be dinner, it would be an overnight trip. Liam's "okay, be safe" was heavy with a familiar resignation. Isabella, who was clearing Leo's dinner plate, heard the exchange. She saw the brief flicker of disappointment in Liam's eyes before he masked it with a tired smile. The original plan had been leftover pasta, a silent, solitary meal for Liam in the cavernous kitchen. But Isabella changed the plan. An hour later, the sterile, silent house was filled with an aroma that was rich and warm and alive. It was the scent of garlic sizzling in golden olive oil, of sweet paprika and saffron, of onions caramelizing into jammy sweetness. Liam was drawn from his study by the smell, finding her at the stove, her dark hair tied up loosely with a pencil, a smudge of tomato sauce on her cheek. She was making paella, a taste of her home. "I thought," she said, without turning around, as if she had sensed him there, "that maybe you would like something better than old pasta." It was more than just a meal. It was an act of care, a gesture of seeing him in a way he hadn't been seen in years. They ate at the large kitchen island, the grand dining room with its ghost chairs feeling a million miles away. At first, the conversation was light, about the food, about her family in Valencia, but then she turned her warm, honey-colored eyes on him, a look of genuine curiosity in them. "Alara told me you are a writer," she began, her voice soft. "What kind of stories do you tell?" The question was so simple, yet it struck him with the force of a revelation. Alara knew he was a writer the way she knew their mortgage rate, or the day the recycling was collected. It was a fact, a data point in their shared life. She no longer asked about the stories. She hadn't read a manuscript of his in 5 years. Liam found himself talking, the words rusty at first, then flowing more freely as he spoke of his stalled novel, a historical fiction piece about a cartographer lost at sea. Isabella didn't just listen, she heard him. She asked about his research, about the protagonist's motivations. She mentioned a Borges story that touched on similar themes of maps and reality. In that moment, she wasn't the au pair. She was an intellectual equal, a confidant, a warm presence in the vast, echoing loneliness he called a life. The seed of connection, planted in the fertile ground of his neglect, had begun to sprout. These moments became their secret ritual, blooming in the spaces Alara's ambition created. When Alara went to Chicago for a 3-day conference, the house transformed. It was no longer a silent museum, but a quiet, comfortable home. The first night, after Leo was tucked into bed, they found themselves in the living room, the massive television screen dark. The silence felt different now, not empty, but charged. "There is a film by a Spanish director, Almodovar, that I love," she suggested, her voice casual. "It might feel a little like home to me." They sat on the sprawling white sofa, a respectable distance between them, but the space felt electric. As the film played, with its vibrant colors and passionate, tangled relationships, Liam was intensely aware of her next to him. The scent of her shampoo, something clean and floral. The soft sound of her breathing. At one point, she shivered, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "The air conditioning is always so cold in American houses," she whispered, laughing softly. He retrieved a cashmere throw from a nearby chair, the one Alara called their decorative blanket, and unfolded it. As he draped it over her, his fingers brushed the bare skin of her shoulder. Her skin was warm, smooth. She turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his in the flickering light of the screen. The look held for a beat too long, a silent acknowledgement that this was not about the cold. He pulled his hand back as if burned, his heart hammering against his ribs. The next night, they shared a bottle of wine, a deep, heavy Rioja that she had picked out. With the wine came conversation, deeper and more personal this time. He spoke of the man he used to be, the hopeful young writer who had believed words could change the world. She spoke of her home, painting a picture of sun-drenched streets and boisterous family dinners. Her stories were vivid, yet he noticed she never revealed too much of her own heart, her own pains or ambitions. She was a mirror, reflecting back the parts of himself he missed the most, while keeping her own depths carefully hidden. Their knees brushed under the table. She didn't move away. He didn't move away. The contact was a low, steady hum of energy that ran through his entire body. He was consumed by a quiet, agonizing battle with himself. He knew this path, this series of small, seemingly innocent moments, was leading somewhere dangerous. He was a husband, a father. She was his son's caregiver, a young woman with her life ahead of her, entrusted to their care. Yet, every rational thought was drowned out by the intoxicating feeling of being seen, of being wanted. He started to feel a guilty thrill when Alara's name would flash on his phone, knowing it was a call to cancel, to postpone, to remain absent. That night, as he lay alone in the king-sized bed he shared with his wife, the sheets felt cold and vast. He could hear the faint sound of the floorboards creaking as Isabella moved in her room down the hall. He closed his eyes, but all he could see was the memory of his fingers on her warm skin. All he could feel was the terrifying, exhilarating pull of a connection that promised to either save him or destroy him completely. The peak of summer arrived, and with it came a heat that was relentless, suffocating. The air in the house was a cool, recycled lie against the shimmering heat waves rising from the asphalt of the driveway. For Liam, this constant, oppressive warmth was a mirror of the fever that had taken root inside him. His life, once defined by the quiet, orderly progression of days, had been completely reoriented around a new Sunday Isabella. He had become a secret cartographer of her existence, mapping her movements, her habits, her very presence in his home. His obsession was a sensory one, a complete hijacking of his perception. It began with her scent. It was something light and clean, a whisper of verbena and citrus that clung to the air in the hallway after she passed, that rose from the clean laundry she folded. He'd find himself inhaling deeply when he passed her room, a guilty, addictive little ritual, trying to capture the ghost of her presence. It was a scent that was so fundamentally different from Alara's, which was a complex, expensive perfume that announced her arrival and departure. Isabella's scent was a part of the air itself, something you breathed in without thinking, until you couldn't imagine the air without it. But it was his eyes that betrayed him the most. His gaze, once turned inward on his fictional worlds, was now constantly, irrevocably drawn to her. He would sit in his study, the blank page on his screen mocking him, and find himself watching her through the large window as she played with Leo in the garden. She'd wear a pair of faded denim shorts and a simple, thin t-shirt, and the sight would paralyze him. He'd watch as she knelt in the grass to examine a bug with his son, and the soft cotton of her shirt would pull taut across the full curve of her breasts. When she stood and stretched, arching her back to the sun, his breath would catch in his throat. He would trace the line of her spine, the gentle indentation of her waist, the perfect, round swell of her hips and bottom framed by the worn denim. He knew every line of her body from this distance, a voyeur in his own home. He would imagine the heat of her skin, the feel of that soft curve of her waist under his hands. The fantasy was so vivid, so powerful, that he would have to turn away from the window, his heart pounding with a mixture of raw desire and a self-loathing so profound it made him feel sick. He saw her everywhere. He'd walk past the laundry room and through the half-open door, see her folding clothes, humming a soft Spanish lullaby. He would see her hands, graceful and quick, as she folded Leo's tiny shirts, his own boxers, Alara's silk blouses. And then, he'd see her pause, holding a pair of her own underwear, a delicate piece of dark lace, and the moment felt so intensely private, so forbidden, that he would freeze in the hallway, hidden in the shadows. He felt like a thief, stealing a glimpse of an intimacy he had no right to, and he began to notice that she knew. Her awareness of his gaze was a subtle shift in the current between them. It was nothing overt, nothing Alara or anyone else would ever notice, but he felt it. If she caught him looking from the study window, she wouldn't scurry away or act embarrassed. Instead, she might hold her stretch for a moment longer, or brush a strand of dark hair from her face with a slow, languid movement. She was performing for an audience of one. The game escalated. Her clothing, always appropriate, began to carry a new subtle charge. The neckline of a simple top might be just a fraction of an inch lower than before, revealing the smooth, sun-kissed skin of her décolletage. The shorts she wore around the house seemed to get just a little shorter, showcasing more of her long, tanned legs. It was a masterclass in plausible deniability. They were just summer clothes, after all. But Liam knew. He saw the intent. The most potent moment, the one that burned itself into his memory, happened one afternoon in the living room. Alara was, as usual, working late. Liam was on the sofa, pretending to read, while Isabella was on the floor, helping Leo with a drawing. She was wearing a loose-fitting sweater over a tank top. She laughed at something Leo said, a full, genuine laugh that filled the quiet room, and as she threw her head back, the sweater slipped off one shoulder. It was a simple, accidental movement. But what followed was not. She didn't immediately fix it. She let it hang there, revealing the delicate, smooth line of her shoulder and a thin, white bra strap against her tan skin. She turned her head as if to ask him a question about dinner, and her eyes met his. His gaze was fixed on that strap, on that bare shoulder. And she saw it. She held his gaze for a second, a flicker of something knowing, a hint of a smile at the corner of her mouth. Then, slowly, deliberately, she reached up with one hand, hooked a single graceful finger under the strap, and slid it back into place, her eyes never leaving his. The message was as clear as a spoken word. I see you looking, and I want you to look. His nights became a landscape of torment. He would lie beside Alara, her breathing even and slow in sleep, and his own body would be rigid, wired with a frantic, unspent energy. He felt like a monster, his mind filled with the image of another woman, a woman who slept just down the hall. He would close his eyes and see the curve of Isabella's hips, the sheen of sweat on her skin in the summer heat, the way her honey-colored eyes seemed to hold a secret promise just for him. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He was betraying his wife not with his body, not yet, but with every thought, every beat of his adulterous heart. The desire was a poison, seeping into every part of his life, killing his creativity, stealing his peace. He was trapped in a beautiful cage with the object of his obsession, a constant, agonizing temptation that was stripping him down to his most basic, primal instincts. He knew, with a certainty that terrified him, that this exquisite torture could not last. The string had been pulled too taut. It was only a matter of time before it snapped. The breaking point came on a Friday. Alara had flown to San Francisco for a weekend symposium on sustainable architecture, leaving behind a house that felt both cavernously empty and electrically charged. The air all day had been unnaturally still, the sky a bruised greenish yellow. A storm was coming. Not a summer shower, but something angrier, something torn from the guts of the Atlantic. Liam felt it in his bones, a low thrum of anxiety and anticipation that had nothing to do with the weather. He and Isabella moved through the afternoon in a state of carefully orchestrated avoidance, their orbits intentionally kept wide. They spoke only of logistics, of Leo's dinner and bedtime, their words like carefully placed stones across a rushing river of things unsaid. By the time Leo was asleep, the first fat drops of rain were beginning to smack against the vast glass walls of the house, and the sky had turned a deep, bruised purple. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that seemed to seep through the window seals. The first clap of thunder was a violent crack that shook the house to its foundations. The lights flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the cavernous space into an inky, disorienting darkness. Only the frantic, blue-white flashes of lightning offered brief, strobe-like glimpses of the room. The candles, Liam said, his voice sounding too loud in the sudden silence. In the kitchen. They found them by the light of their phones, their movements clumsy and uncertain in the dark. As Isabella lit the wicks, the small flames blossomed, casting a warm, dancing glow that pushed back the oppressive darkness. The candlelight softened the house's sharp, modern edges, transforming the sterile living room into something intimate, ancient, and confessional. The storm was a wild beast raging outside, sealing them in, creating a world that consisted only of that small, flickering circle of light. "We should have some wine," she suggested, her voice a low murmur that was almost swallowed by a gust of wind rattling the windows. It wasn't a question. He found a bottle of deep, blood-red Merlot, and they sat on the floor, leaning against the large sofa, the wine and the candlelight slowly dissolving the last of their restraints. The conversation started about the storm, but quickly drifted into more personal territory. He found himself confessing the depth of his loneliness, the feeling of being a ghost in his own life, his words pouring out of him like a dam finally breaking. He spoke of his creative silence, of the fear that he had lost the one part of himself that he had ever truly valued. Isabella listened, her knees drawn up to her chin, her honey-colored eyes reflecting the candlelight, seeming to absorb all of his pain and insecurity. She didn't offer platitudes or easy solutions. She simply listened, her quiet, focused attention a more potent balm than any words could have been. And in that moment, under the spell of the storm and the wine, he felt a dangerous, intoxicating gratitude. He felt seen. The conversation eventually died out, leaving a silence that was heavier, more charged than any of the words had been. All that was left was the sound of the rain, the distant rumble of thunder, and the frantic beating of his own heart. He looked at her, really looked at her. Her face, half in shadow, was a portrait of impossible beauty. Her lips were slightly parted, stained red from the wine. He saw a vulnerability there, or maybe he only projected his own. He didn't know. He only knew that the ache inside him, the weeks of obsessive longing, had become a physical, unbearable pressure. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and brushed a stray strand of dark hair from her cheek. Her skin was impossibly soft. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, a silent, breathtaking surrender. It was all the permission he needed. He closed the small distance between them and kissed her. The first touch of their lips was soft, almost hesitant, a question asked in the dark. But her response, the slight parting of her lips, the soft sigh that escaped her, turned the question into a desperate, hungry answer. The kiss deepened, all the weeks of stolen glances, of unspoken desire, pouring into it. It was a kiss of relief, of transgression, of utter damnation. They broke apart, gasping for air. Her eyes were dark, her breath coming in short, shallow pants. "Liam," she whispered, her voice husky. "No, Alara." The name was a ghost in the room, a flimsy shield against the tidal wave of what was happening. It was a protest born of obligation, not conviction. He silenced it with another kiss, this one harder, more demanding, and he felt the last of her resistance melt away. There were no more words. There was only the storm inside, now unleashed and just as powerful as the one outside. With a low groan, he slid his arms under her, lifting her from the floor. Her arms wrapped around his neck, her body light in his. He carried her up the floating staircase, through the darkness, bypassing the master bedroom, his and Alara's room, a sanctuary he could not bring himself to defile. He carried her to the guest room at the end of the hall, a neutral, anonymous space for the sin they were about to commit. He laid her gently on the bed, the white duvet a stark canvas in the flashes of lightning that illuminated the room. His hands, shaking with a desperate urgency, found the zipper on the back of her simple cotton dress. He pulled it down, the sound unnaturally loud. He peeled the fabric from her shoulders, letting it fall to the floor in a careless heap, and then he saw it. In another flash of lightning, the room was lit in brilliant, momentary detail. She was wearing a matching set of lingerie, the color of deep, dark wine, almost black in the shadows. It was lace, intricate and delicate, a stark, erotic contrast to her youthful innocence. And in that split second, a cold, clear thought pierced through the fog of his desire. She had been waiting for this. She had been ready. But the thought was swept away by the next wave of need. His mouth found the warm, smooth skin of her shoulder, and he heard her sharp intake of breath. The feeble sound of protest she might have made was lost, replaced by a low, guttural moan she tried to stifle against the pillow. It was the sound of a battle being lost, of a complete and total surrender to the pleasure of the moment. As the storm outside finally broke, unleashing its torrential, cleansing fury upon the world, the storm inside them did the same. washing away everything in its path, leaving only the wreckage of their bodies, tangled together in the dark. The morning after the storm was unnaturally beautiful. The world outside the glass walls was washed clean, glistening a vibrant, impossible green under a brilliant, cloudless sky. But inside the house, the air was thick and stale with the residue of their sin. An awkward, suffocating silence hung between Liam and Isabella. They avoided each other's eyes at the breakfast table, their conversation with Leo a forced, too bright performance. The guest room, when Liam walked past it, was pristine. The bed was made with military precision, the wine glasses gone, the windows open to the clean morning air. Isabella had erased the evidence. The act was a testament to her composure, a silent declaration that what had happened was a secret to be buried, not a confession to be made. It was terrifying, and in a way he couldn't yet understand, it was also thrilling. The shared secret was a live wire between them now, a dangerous current that hummed beneath the surface of their new reality. Their affair didn't begin again with another storm or a drunken confession. It began with a new language, a secret dialect of glances and gestures that only they understood. It was the way her eyes would meet his across the dinner table as Alara recounted a story about her day, a fleeting moment of shared conspiracy that made his heart leap. It was the way his hand would accidentally brush against hers as they both reached for the milk in the refrigerator, a touch that lingered for a half-second too long, sending a jolt of heat through his veins. They became experts in the art of proximity, of standing just close enough to feel the warmth of each other's bodies, of speaking in low tones that felt intimate even when discussing the most mundane things. They were building a secret world for two, right under the roof of the life he had built with his wife. The guilt was a constant low-grade fever in his blood. Every time Alara touched him, her familiar hand on his arm, a casual kiss on the cheek, he would feel a reflexive urge to pull away, as if his body was no longer his to be given. He felt like a fraud, a hollow man performing the role of a husband. Yet poisonously, the affair fed him. The writer's block that had paralyzed him for nearly a year began to dissolve. He found himself back at his desk, the words finally flowing, fueled by the volatile cocktail of guilt, desire, and adrenaline. His writing became darker, more passionate, more alive. He was creating again, and the terrible truth was that his transgression had been the catalyst. The sin that was destroying his marriage was simultaneously resurrecting his art, a paradox that left him feeling both powerful and monstrous. He was living a lie, but for the first time in years he felt truly, dangerously alive. And the memory of that night, the feel of her skin, the sound of her surrender, was a constant, gnawing hunger that demanded to be fed again. He knew it was madness, a path to certain ruin, but it was a madness he found himself unwilling and unable to resist. The second time was different. It wasn't born of darkness and storm. It was born of a quiet, sunlit afternoon. It was a conscious choice, a deliberate step further into the abyss. Alara was at her office downtown. Leo was upstairs, deep in his afternoon nap. The house was completely silent, a silence that felt less like peace and more like an opportunity. Liam was in his study, trying to work, but his mind was on her. He heard her soft footsteps in the hall, and then she was there, standing in his doorway, a cup of coffee in her hand. She wore a simple gray tank top and a pair of white shorts. She looked impossibly young, impossibly beautiful. She set the mug down on his desk, the ceramic clicking softly against the wood. But she didn't leave. Her hand came to rest on his shoulder, her fingers light but firm. "You work too hard," she murmured, her voice a low, intimate hum. He covered her hand with his own, his thumb stroking the back of her wrist. Without a word, she moved around the desk, closed the study door, and turned the old brass lock. The sound of the bolt sliding home was the loudest thing he had ever heard. It was the sound of a final boundary being crossed. There was no storm to blame this time, no wine, no darkness. There was only them and their choice. The risk was a powerful aphrodisiac. At any moment, Leo could wake up and call for her. Alara, in a rare change of plans, could walk through the front door. The possibility of discovery hung in the air, sharp and metallic, and it made everything more intense. She pushed the scattered papers off his desk with a sweep of her arm, sending his carefully constructed words fluttering to the floor. She sat on the edge of the desk, pulling him toward her. This time was not a tender exploration. It was a frantic, desperate collision. It was the raw, unrestrained release of a hunger that had been simmering for days. Her nails dug into his back as he pulled her tank top over her head, her skin smelling of sunshine and that clean citrus scent that drove him mad. The sounds were terrifyingly loud in the quiet house, their ragged gasps for air, the soft, rhythmic impact of their bodies, the creak of the old wooden desk beneath them. He could hear every distant noise, a car passing on the street, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, and each sound was a spike of adrenaline, a reminder of how close to the edge they were. She leaned close to his ear, her hot breath a torment, her whispers a litany of profane encouragement. "Here, Liam," she gasped, her hips moving against his. "Right here. I want them to almost hear us." The thought was depraved, and it sent a shock of pure lust through him. As the pleasure began to build, a desperate, unstoppable wave, her voice was a sharp, commanding plea. "Oh, Liam, faster! Please, right there!" It was a sound of pure, unadulterated pleasure, a sound of ecstasy and ruin, a sound that he knew would haunt him for the rest of his life. In the heart of his home, in the sanctuary of his work, surrounded by the books he loved and the pictures of the family he was destroying, they committed their second sin, and it was infinitely more damning than the first. Liam had come to see Isabella as a creature of pure, uninhibited feeling. To him, she was the living embodiment of the passion that had been dormant in his own life for so long. She was the storm, the wine, the frantic, sunlit transgression. He saw her as an instinctual being, driven by the same untamable desires that had consumed him. He was so lost in the intoxicating haze of their affair, so focused on the curve of her hip or the taste of her mouth, that he failed to see the other Isabella, the one who existed behind the honey-colored eyes. He failed to see the observer, the strategist, the cool, calculating mind that was always watching, always learning, always cataloging the weaknesses of the world she had entered. He mistook her passion for a lack of cunning, and it was a miscalculation that would ultimately cost him everything. He only ever saw the reflection of his own desire, never the woman who was holding the mirror. While he saw their affair as a shared descent into chaos, she saw it as a calculated acquisition of power. She studied them, both him and Alara, with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing specimens in a jar. She learned the fault lines in their marriage, the precise pressure points of his loneliness and Alara's ambition. She knew, perhaps better than Liam himself, the rhythms of his guilt and the patterns of his rationalizations. She saw the way Alara moved through the house like a high-powered executive visiting a branch office, her love for her family real but compartmentalized, filed away behind deadlines and client demands. Isabella saw all of this not with judgment, but with a quiet, unnerving clarity. She was not just Liam's lover. She was a scholar of their dysfunction, and she was waiting patiently for the opportunity to use her research. The opportunity came on a sweltering Saturday in late July. Alara, in a rare, domestically focused mood, had decided their son's old baby clothes should be donated. "They're in the attic," she'd said to Isabella, a casual, throwaway instruction. "In some boxes by the far window. Could you possibly sort through them when you have a moment?" To Liam, it was a simple chore. To Isabella, it was a key, handed to her, granting access to the one part of the house she had not yet explored, its memory. The attic was a stifling, forgotten space, smelling of cedar, dust, and time itself. Old furniture stood under white sheets like sleeping ghosts. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, slanted through a single grimy porthole window. It was the family's subconscious, a tomb of discarded histories. Isabella moved with a quiet purpose, her footsteps soft on the old wooden floorboards. She found the boxes of Leo's tiny clothes easily enough, but her eyes were scanning, searching, and then she saw it. Tucked away behind a stack of Alara's old architectural portfolios was a small, unadorned cedar box. It had no label. It seemed deliberately hidden. Her heart gave a single, hard thump, a beat of predator's excitement. She pried the lid open. It wasn't full of photographs or mementos. It was full of letters, a thick bundle tied with a faded sky blue silk ribbon. The envelopes were addressed to Alara, at her maiden name, at an old address in the city, but the postmarks were from the first year of her marriage to Liam. The handwriting was a confident, masculine scrawl. With methodical calm, Isabella untied the ribbon. She sat on the dusty floor, the oppressive heat of the attic forgotten, and began to read. She was not prepared for what she found. The letters were from a man named Daniel, a colleague from Alara's first architectural firm. They were not love letters in the traditional sense. They were something more insidious, more intimate. They were letters of deep, emotional communion. Daniel wrote of their stolen lunches, of conversations where he felt truly seen for the first time. He wrote with aching tenderness about Alara's brilliance, her frustrations with a husband who, in Daniel's words, was a good man, but one who lives in a world of words, not in the world with you. He never explicitly mentioned a physical affair, but he painted a vivid picture of a profound emotional betrayal, a secret world of intimacy that Alara had shared with him while her new husband was struggling to write his first novel. As Isabella read, a strange, cold clarity settled over her. There was no flicker of jealousy, no pang of moral outrage for Liam's sake. What she felt was a profound, chilling sense of vindication. The entire moral landscape of her situation had just been redrawn. She was no longer the singular homewrecker, the venomous serpent in their domestic Eden. She was merely a continuation, a symptom of a disease that had been present from the very beginning. The perfect, wronged Alara, the brilliant, untouchable wife, whose ghost haunted every one of Isabella's encounters with Liam, was a myth. She had her own sin, her own secret box buried in the attic. The knowledge was intoxicating. It was power. In the dusty, stifling heat, a slow, triumphant smile spread across Isabella's face. This changed everything. The letters were not just a secret, they were a shield, they were insurance. They were a weapon of mutually assured destruction, and she was the only one who knew the launch codes. With the precision of a spy, she put the letters back, retying the faded blue ribbon exactly as she had found it. She slid the cedar box back into its hiding place, behind the portfolios. But she did not leave empty-handed. She selected one letter from the middle of the bundle, one that was particularly damning in its emotional intimacy, folded it carefully, and slipped it into the waistband of her shorts. Her own piece of collateral. She went back to sorting the baby clothes, her mind working, recalibrating, planning her next move. When she came down from the attic an hour later, her face was slightly flushed from the heat, and a thin film of dust coated her arms. Liam saw her at the bottom of the stairs. "Find everything okay?" he asked, his eyes immediately dropping to the line of her collar, his mind on nothing but their next stolen moment. "Yes," she said, her voice perfectly even. "Everything I was looking for." He saw nothing different in her expression. He was so blinded by his lust he couldn't see the new, hard glint of steel in her eyes. He couldn't know that the young, passionate woman he thought he was controlling had just found the master key to his entire life, and that she was already planning which doors she was going to unlock, and which ones she was going to burn to the ground. The change in Isabella was not a sudden storm, but a slow, almost imperceptible shift in the climate of the house. Liam felt it first as a subtle atmospheric pressure, a change he couldn't quite name. The sweet, almost deferential young woman he had first taken to his bed was beginning to recede, and in her place someone new was emerging, someone with a sharper, more confident edge. A new boldness hardened the look in her honey-colored eyes, and her movements through the house took on a sense of ownership, of belonging, that bordered on entitlement. At first, he told himself he was imagining it. He reasoned that she was simply growing more comfortable in her role, more confident in their illicit relationship, but a persistent gnawing unease in the pit of his stomach told him it was something more. The balance of their secret world had been disturbed, and he was no longer the one in control. In fact, he was beginning to suspect that he never had been. The first hint came disguised as a piece of casual conversation. It was a Sunday morning, and for once, the three of them were in the kitchen together. Alara was scrolling through emails on her phone, half present as always, while Liam made pancakes. Isabella was leaning against the counter, watching him, a thoughtful expression on her face. "It's funny," she said, her voice light. conversational. I was watching an old movie last night. It was about this perfect family, a beautiful wife who everyone in town admired, a saint. She paused, picking up an apple and examining its flawless red skin, but she had a secret, a big one. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? She took a slow, deliberate bite of the apple, and her eyes, sharp and intelligent, met Liam's over the top of it. Everyone has secrets. Even the ones who seem the most perfect. Alara grunted in distracted agreement, her focus still on her screen, but Liam felt a jolt, a sudden, cold spike of panic. The word secret hung in the air between them, aimed at him like a dart. Was she talking about their affair? Was it a warning? The ambiguity was a form of torture, a small, perfectly calibrated dose of psychological poison. She was testing him, and the fear in his eyes was precisely the reaction she was looking for. The game continued, her words becoming more pointed, her questions more probing. A few days later, she found him in his study. He was staring at his manuscript, the words he had written while high on the thrill of their affair, now seeming fraudulent and cheap. She came and stood behind him, her presence a silent pressure. She looked over his shoulder at the pages, then her gaze drifted to his bookshelves. "You write so many stories about men and their mistakes," she mused, her fingers tracing the spine of a leather-bound classic, men who betray their wives, men who are ruined by their desires. Her touch was light, but her words were heavy. "Have you ever thought of writing about a woman's betrayal? About a wife whose loyalty wasn't what it seemed?" The word landed, again, with a sickening thud. Loyalty. It was a direct accusation, a twisting of the knife of his own guilt. But there was a subtext he couldn't grasp, a hidden layer of meaning that made her question feel even more menacing. "It's just an idea," she added, with a sweet, disarming smile, before turning and leaving him alone in the suffocating silence, his mind racing, trying to decipher the code of her new, terrifying language. This new dynamic bled into their physical relationship, changing its very nature. The frantic, mutual passion was replaced by something colder, more performative. She was the one who initiated every encounter now, her advances no longer seductive but declarative. The thrill of the forbidden was replaced by the chill of subjugation. One afternoon, she cornered him in the narrow pantry off the kitchen, the door swinging shut behind them, plunging them into a darkness that smelled of spices and dried goods. She pressed him against the shelves, his back against hard cans of tomatoes, and kissed him. The kiss was not passionate, it was possessive. Her hands were rough, her movements efficient, her goal not shared ecstasy, but his submission. It was a stark, almost brutal assertion of her power over him, her body a tool to remind him of his weakness, his complicity. In the dark, she whispered against his ear, but the words were not of pleasure. "You belong to me now, don't you, Liam?" It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. The encounter left him feeling hollowed out, used, a pawn in a game whose rules she was inventing as she went along. The desire was still there, a Pavlovian response he couldn't control, but it was now laced with a profound and growing dread. He was addicted to his own destruction. He was trapped. The thought of ending it was terrifying, not just because he still craved her, but because he was now deeply afraid of her. What did she want? What did she know? He began to watch her obsessively, trying to understand the source of her newfound power, but her public performance was flawless. With Alara and Leo, she remained the perfect au pair, sweet, attentive, and utterly trustworthy. This duality made her even more frightening. She was a master of deception, and he was completely at her mercy. The final, chilling confirmation of this came late one night. He couldn't sleep. He went downstairs for a drink and found her in the kitchen, bathed in the cold, white light of the open refrigerator. He decided to confront her, his voice a raw, desperate whisper. "Isabella, what is this? What are you doing? What do you want from me?" She closed the refrigerator door, the light cutting out, leaving them in the dim moonlight filtering through the windows. She turned to him, her face a pale, unreadable mask. A slow, cold smile touched her lips but did not reach her eyes. "Want?" she repeated softly. "I don't want anything, Liam." She took a step closer, raising her hand to his cheek. Her touch was cold. "I just think a marriage, a family, it should be built on a foundation of truth, No more secrets. Everyone should be honest about what they've done. Don't you agree? It's only fair. Her thumb stroked his cheek, a gesture that felt like a threat, a promise of exposure. Then she turned and walked away, her footsteps silent on the marble floor, leaving him frozen in the darkness. He finally understood. He didn't know how, and he didn't know why, but the power had not just shifted, she had taken all of it. And he was now, in every sense of the word, her prisoner. The affair was no longer a secret fire that warmed Liam in his lonely life. It had become a corrosive acid, eating away at the foundations of the home he had built. And Isabella was the one controlling the drip, applying it with terrifying precision. Her campaign of psychological warfare was not waged with shouts and accusations, but with whispers. Her words were like fine, invisible threads, slowly, expertly woven into the tapestry of their family life until the whole picture was warped, the original image of happiness and trust distorted into a grotesque parody. She had moved beyond simply controlling Liam. She was now actively dismantling Alara, using the intimate knowledge she had gained from her lover as a weapon against his wife. It was a subtle, insidious game, and she played it with the chilling expertise of a master. The first phase of her attack was to blur the boundaries of intimacy, to make Alara feel like a stranger in her own marriage. It began with small, seemingly innocent remarks. One evening, Alara was recounting the exhausting details of a battle with a particularly stubborn zoning commissioner. Liam listened, making the appropriate sympathetic noises, having heard a more detailed, angrier version from her on the phone earlier that day. He had later vented his own frustrations about the situation to Isabella, sharing a specific, cutting remark Alara had made about the commissioner's incompetence. Now, at the dinner table, Isabella looked at Alara with a bright, helpful expression. "That sounds so difficult, Alara," she said, her tone dripping with faux empathy. "It's just like Liam was saying. He told me you felt the man had the intellectual curiosity of a garden gnome. It is so lovely that you two are so close you can share everything about your work." A dead silence fell over the table. Alara's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. She turned to Liam, a confused, sharp look in her eyes. "I said that to you in confidence, Liam. When were you discussing my work with Isabella?" Liam felt the blood drain from his face. He was trapped. I was just explaining how stressful your job is," he stammered, the lie tasting like poison. "I must have mentioned it." Alara said nothing, but the seed of doubt was planted. The private circle of her marriage had been breached. She now had to wonder, what else did Liam share with the au pair? What other private, intimate details of her life were being discussed when she wasn't there? Isabella repeated this tactic with devastating effect, using small pieces of Liam's knowledge to position herself as the true mistress of the house. When Alara was frantically searching for a pair of antique earrings her grandmother had left her, Isabella found them in a forgotten jewelry box. "Here they are," she'd said, holding them out. "Liam told me a beautiful story once about how your grandmother wore these on her wedding day. He said you only wear them on the most special occasions." Alara took the earrings, her expression unreadable. It was true. But Liam telling Isabella that story felt like a violation, a sharing of a sacred memory that was not his to give away. Isabella was subtly demonstrating that she knew the family's history, its secrets, its emotional treasures. She was making Alara feel like a guest, a visitor who no longer knew where things were kept, either physically or emotionally. While she was planting these seeds of paranoia in Alara's mind, she was simultaneously tightening her grip on Liam, using her knowledge of Alara's past affair as a constant, unspoken threat. She never mentioned the letters. She never said the name Daniel. She didn't have to. The leverage was far more powerful when it remained a ghostly, undefined menace. One night, Alara was getting ready for a hospital gala, an event where she was being honored. She looked magnificent in a dark blue, floor-length gown. Liam, caught in a rare, uncomplicated moment of awe for his wife, told her she was the most beautiful woman in the room. Isabella, who was watching from the doorway, smiled her sweet, poisonous smile. "She is," she agreed, her eyes locking with Liam's. "So elegant, so worthy of a husband's complete devotion. I think a man's first love, his only love, is the most beautiful thing in the world. To have a love that is pure, with no secrets from the very beginning, that is a rare gift. Don't you think so, Liam? To Alara, it sounded like the romantic, naive rambling of a young girl. But Liam heard the true message. First love, only love, no secrets. She was talking about Daniel. She was reminding him that Alara's fidelity was not as pure as it seemed, and that his own sins were not the only ones. She was telling him, in her secret language, that she could expose them both. He felt a cold dread wash over him, the compliment to his wife turning to ash in his mouth. He was living in a psychological prison of her design. He was terrified of what she would say next, of what seemingly innocent comment would be laced with a hidden threat. The affair was now a source of pure terror. The stolen moments of passion felt like transactions in which he was selling off pieces of his soul in exchange for a silence he knew she could break at any moment. Alara, for her part, was becoming a ghost in her own home. She was a smart woman, and she knew something was deeply wrong. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tensions. The house no longer felt safe. It felt like enemy territory. She found herself watching them, trying to decipher the shared glances, the half-finished sentences. She was on the outside of a secret she couldn't name, and the isolation was making her sharp, suspicious, and deeply unhappy. The game of whispers was working perfectly. Isabella, the quiet observer, was now the one controlling the narrative, turning their home into a theater of paranoia where every word had a double meaning and every silence was filled with the scream of impending disaster. The humid August night air was thick and stagnant, pressing in on the house, making it impossible to breathe. Liam felt like he was suffocating, not from the weather, but from the relentless, silent pressure of Isabella's control. He was a man walking on a wire, and his nerve was gone. The constant fear of exposure, the intricate web of lies he was forced to maintain, and the chilling psychological game she played had worn him down to a fragile, trembling husk. He was a prisoner awaiting a sentence, and the waiting had become a torture worse than any punishment he could imagine. He had begun to fantasize about confession, about the cleansing fire of Alara's rage, about the destruction of his life, if only it would mean an end to this slow, agonizing bleed. The passion had long since curdled into a sick, codependent dread, and he knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that he was losing his mind. He was standing in the upstairs hallway, a ghost in his own home, unable to bring himself to enter the bedroom where his wife slept peacefully. The thought of lying next to her, of pretending to be the man she thought she had married, was a hypocrisy his fractured soul could no longer bear. The house was dead silent. The only sound, the low hum of the air conditioner and the frantic, bird-like flutter of his own heart. And then, he saw her. She emerged from the shadows at the far end of the hall, like a creature from a nightmare, a specter of his own sin. She wasn't wearing a robe or pajamas. She was wearing a web of black lace and silk, a stark, deliberate statement of sexuality that was anything but seductive. It was armor. It was a uniform. It was the costume of a queen coming to claim her territory. He had never seen it before, and he understood instantly that she had saved it for this, for a moment of ultimate transgression. Her face was a pale, emotionless mask in the dim light, her eyes holding his, pinning him to the spot. He expected her to beckon him to her room, or to the guest room where their affair had begun, but she did something far more cruel, far more audacious. She walked silently toward him, stopping just before the closed door of his and Alara's bedroom. She raised a single, slender finger and pointed it, not at him, but at the door. "She is in there," Isabella whispered, her voice a blade of ice, sleeping, dreaming her innocent dreams. Then her eyes, cold and hard, met his again. "And you are out here, with me." She turned, her back to him, the intricate straps of the black lingerie a stark pattern against her skin. "My room is too small for what I want tonight," she said, her voice dropping to a low, commanding tone. "Your study. I want you in your chair. Now." There was no room for negotiation. It was not a request. It was a royal decree. And he, her broken, terrified subject, had no choice but to obey. The short walk down the stairs and into his study was the longest of his life. He felt like he was being led to his own execution. He was acutely aware of every sound, the whisper of her bare feet on the cool hardwood floor, the almost imperceptible creak of a floorboard, the sound of his own ragged, shallow breathing. Each noise was a potential alarm, a potential discovery, a potential end to everything. But the house remained silent, a sleeping witness to his final humiliation. She followed him into the study and closed the door behind them, turning the lock with a soft, definitive click. The only light came from the pale, ghostly glow of his computer's screensaver, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. She didn't come to him, didn't kiss him. She simply stood by the desk, waiting. And he understood. He walked to his large, leather office chair, the seat of his authority, the place where he was supposed to be the master of his own universe, and sat down. He felt small, powerless, a king being dethroned in his own throne room. She moved then, with a slow, predatory grace. She perched on the edge of his desk, looking down at him. In the pale light, the black lace was a stark, menacing web against the pale canvas of her skin. She leaned forward, her hands on the arms of his chair, trapping him. "Tonight, Liam, there are no games," she said, her voice low and devoid of any warmth. "There is no passion, there is only the truth. The truth is that you are weak, and that I am strong, and you will do exactly what I say." She pushed him back against the chair, and the act began. It was a cold, loveless, and methodical assertion of dominance. Her movements were not the frantic, passionate gestures of their past encounters. They were efficient, controlled, and deeply, profoundly selfish. Her pleasure was the point, but not in a way that was shared. It was a pleasure taken, a prize plundered. He was merely the instrument of it, a body to be used. His own desire, a sick vestigial reflex he couldn't control, rose to meet her, but it was a desire laced with such profound self-hatred that it felt like pain. He closed his eyes, wanting to disappear, but her voice cut through the darkness. "No," she commanded, her fingers gripping his chin, forcing his head up. "You will look at me. You will watch this." And so he watched, a helpless spectator at his own violation. He watched her face, her expression not one of ecstasy, but of intense, focused concentration, the face of an athlete focused on the win. And when her climax came, it was not with the soft, breathless moans he remembered. It was a sharp, guttural cry, a gasp of air that sounded less like pleasure and more like a predator's victorious snarl. It was the sound of conquest, the sound of his utter and complete defeat. The moment it was over, she pulled away. There was no shared intimacy, no lingering touch. She stood up, turning her back to him as she coolly adjusted a strap on her shoulder. Her work was done. She looked at him, still slumped in the chair, and her expression was one of faint, clinical disgust. "Get yourself cleaned up," she said, her voice flat, as if speaking to a messy child. She unlocked the door, and without a backward glance, slipped out of the room, a black shadow vanishing into the silent house, leaving him alone in the ruins. He sat there for a long time, the only sound, the quiet hum of the computer. He was numb, hollowed out, a building that had been gutted by fire, the shell still standing, but everything of value inside turned to ash. He was no longer a man having an affair. He was a possession, a thing. And he knew, in the cold, dead center of his soul, that the price for his weakness was a debt he would never, ever be able to repay. The beautiful, sterile house of glass and white stone had become a pressure cooker, and the air inside was thick with the steam of unspoken truths. The game of whispers had reached its end game, leaving a trail of psychological shrapnel that littered every room. Liam was a ghost, a hollowed-out man haunted by his own choices. He moved through the days in a state of muted panic, his eyes constantly flicking towards Isabella, not with desire anymore, but with the terrified, pleading look of a hostage seeking instructions from his captor. He had become thin, his sleep plagued by nightmares, and his once passionate burst of creativity had vanished, leaving behind only blank pages and a profound, paralyzing fear. He was a man drowning in plain sight of the shore, and the woman he had wronged was finally beginning to notice the strange, violent currents pulling him under. Alara was an architect. She understood structures, foundations, and the critical importance of integrity. She knew that a building didn't collapse overnight. It began with tiny, almost invisible stress fractures, with a subtle shifting in the foundation, with a quiet groan in the walls that only a trained ear could hear. And she could hear the groaning in her own home. For weeks, She had been trying to ignore it, attributing the strange, tense atmosphere to her own stress, to Liam's creative frustrations. But the signs had become too numerous, too blatant to be dismissed. She would come home from a long day and walk into a silence so heavy it felt like a physical presence, a silence that felt as though she had just missed the end of a crucial, whispered conversation. She noticed the way Liam would flinch if she touched him unexpectedly, the way he could no longer meet her gaze for more than a fleeting second. And she noticed Isabella. The young, sweet au pair had been replaced by a woman whose confidence was unsettling, whose smile never quite reached her eyes. She saw the looks that passed between her husband and the au pair, and she began to understand that they weren't the looks of lovers caught in a passionate, secret romance. They were the looks of a conspirator and a prisoner. There was something more here than a simple, tawdry affair. There was a current of fear, and it was all flowing from Liam, directly towards Isabella. The tipping point, the moment that shifted her from passive unease to active suspicion, was a small, insignificant lie. Liam had claimed to have spent an entire Tuesday locked in his study, wrestling with his manuscript. But later that evening, while tidying his clothes, she found a crumpled receipt in his jeans pocket. It was from that afternoon, from a small, obscure bookstore on the other side of town. A place he had no reason to be. It was a tiny, meaningless discrepancy, but for Alara, it was a hairline crack spreading across a sheet of glass. If he was lying about something so small, what else was he lying about? The question began to haunt her, and with it came a cold, unwelcome clarity. She started to watch them not as a wife and an employer, but as an investigator. And now, with her eyes truly open, she saw everything. The final damning piece of proof came not with a whisper, but in the sacred silence of her own bedroom. It was late. She was getting ready for bed, the weight of the day and the weight of her suspicions pressing down on her. As she sat at her vanity, she unclasped an earring and fumbled it, the small pearl stud bouncing off the dresser and rolling, invisibly, under the king-sized bed. With an exhausted sigh, she got down on her hands and knees, using the light from her phone to search the dark, dusty space beneath the frame. Her fingers swept through the darkness, finding a dust bunny, a forgotten pen, and then something else. It was small and metallic and cold. It wasn't her earring. She pulled her hand back into the light and opened her palm. Lying there was a small silver hoop, adorned with a tiny, intricately carved feather. It was the kind of youthful, bohemian accessory she would never wear, but she had seen it before, every day, in fact, dangling from the ear of Isabella. Time seemed to stop. The air in her lungs turned to ice. An earring, Isabella's earring, under her bed, in her room, the room she shared with her husband. The cold, hard reality of it was a physical blow, knocking the air from her chest. All the pieces of the puzzle, all the strange looks, the whispers, the lies, and the fear slammed into place with the force of a tectonic shift. The garden gnome comment, the unsettling talk of loyalty, Liam's haunted, terrified eyes. It wasn't just an affair, it was an invasion. A long, calculated campaign of deceit and manipulation that had been carried out in her own home right under her nose. She felt a wave of nausea, followed by a surge of rage so cold and pure, it felt like a shard of ice forming in her heart. She hadn't just been betrayed, she had been made a fool of. And she finally understood the fear she saw in her husband's eyes. This wasn't a man cheating. This was a man who had lost control, a man who had made a deal with something far more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. She stood up, the silver earring clutched so tightly in her fist that the post dug into her palm. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. Her mind, the brilliant, architectural mind that designed buildings, was now designing a confrontation. She walked out of the bedroom and down the floating staircase, her movements calm, deliberate, and silent. She could see them in the living room, bathed in the flickering blue light of the television. They were sitting on opposite ends of the sofa, a careful, calculated distance between them, pretending to be absorbed in a movie. It was a perfect portrait of a lie. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs and just stood there, in the shadows of the entryway, watching them. After a moment, Liam sensed her presence. He turned his head, and his eyes met hers. He saw her face, and whatever color was left in his own drained away. He looked like he had seen a ghost. Isabella turned next, her expression of relaxed innocence instantly dissolving when she saw Ilara's face. The game was over. The lie was broken. Ilara said nothing. She simply stood there, the silence in the room stretching into an unbearable, screaming tautness. The perfect facade of their lives had not just cracked, it had been pulverized. And in her clenched fist, she held the single, sharp piece of evidence that was about to bring the whole, rotten structure crashing down. The silence in the room was a fragile, glass-like thing, and Ilara shattered it with a single, deliberate movement. She walked from the shadows of the entryway into the cold blue light of the television. She didn't look at Liam's terrified face or Isabella's cool, composed one. Her eyes were fixed on the sleek glass surface of the coffee table that separated them. She opened her clenched fist and, with a quiet, sharp click, placed the small, silver feather earring in the center of the table. It lay there under the lamplight, a tiny, undeniable monument to their collective sin. "I believe this is yours, Isabella," Ilara said, her voice unnervingly calm, devoid of heat or hysteria. It was the voice she used with incompetent contractors, a voice that could strip a man of his pride with its sheer Arctic control. She then raised her eyes and looked at her husband, "And I believe you can explain how it found its way under our bed." It was not an accusation, it was a verdict. And with it, Liam collapsed. The disintegration was total, a complete structural failure of a man. It began with a choked, guttural sound, and then his entire body seemed to fold in on itself, his head falling into his hands as a torrent of ragged, desperate sobs tore through him. The confession that followed was a pathetic, chaotic flood of words. He confessed to the storm, to the study, to the lies, the whispers, the fear. He confessed to everything, the words tumbling out of him, incoherent with shame and a desperate, selfish need for the relief of unburdening. It was not a plea for forgiveness. It was the final, wretched whimper of a weak man who had been caught. Throughout it all, Isabella did not move. She sat on the sofa, watching Liam's pathetic self-destruction with a look of mild, detached curiosity, like a scientist observing a predictable chemical reaction. There was no triumph in her eyes, no guilt, no fear. There was nothing. She was simply a spectator at the end of a play she had written and directed. When Liam's sobs finally subsided into a series of ragged, watery gasps, Ilara turned her icy gaze to Isabella. Her broken husband was a known quantity, a simple equation of weakness and desire. But this young woman, she was something else entirely. "And you," Ilara said, her voice slicing through the quiet room. "What did you want after all this? The games, the lies. What was the point?" Isabella finally moved. She stood up, her movements fluid and unhurried. She looked at Liam, crumpled on the sofa, and then at Ilara, standing rigid and proud in her pain. A small, almost pitying smile touched her lips. "Want?" she said, her voice a soft, melodic murmur. "You think I wanted him?" The question was a quiet, devastating dismissal of Liam's entire being. "I didn't want anything from you. I just saw things that were out of place, secrets, lies." She took a step towards the door, her part in the drama now over. "I just put them back where they belonged." It was an answer that was no answer at all. A cryptic, chilling statement that framed her not as a homewrecker, but as a kind of cosmic custodian, tidying up a messy, dishonest world. The next morning, the house was as quiet as a tomb. Isabella was gone. Her room was neat, the bed stripped, not a single trace of her existence left behind. Her suitcase was by the front door when a taxi pulled up the long driveway. She said a quiet, gentle goodbye to Leo, who would only ever remember her as the fun friend from Spain. She walked past Liam and Ilara, who stood like statues in the vast, open-plan living space. She offered no apology, no final, cutting remark. Her work was finished. She walked out into the bright morning sun and closed the door softly behind her, leaving them alone in the wreckage. The silver earring still sat on the coffee table, a permanent scar on the heart of their home. The days that followed were defined by a silence more profound and damaging than any argument. The fury and the tears had passed, leaving behind a cold, desolate calm, the way a battlefield is calm after the battle is over. Autumn arrived, and the lush green world outside their glass walls began to die, the leaves turning brittle and brown. It was a fitting backdrop for the death that had occurred inside. The final scene of their marriage was not a dramatic exit or a slammed door. It was this: Alara and Liam, sitting at opposite ends of their long, polished dining table, the 10 feet of empty space between them, a chasm that could never be crossed. They were two strangers, sharing a mortgage. He was a ghost, haunted by what he had done and what had been done to him. She was the stoic keeper of a beautiful, broken mausoleum she had designed herself. The love hadn't just died, it had been surgically removed, leaving a void that ached with its own emptiness. And in the end, one question lingered in the cold, quiet air of the house, a question Liam would ask himself every day for the rest of his life. Who was Isabella? Was she simply a beautiful, cruel girl who saw an opportunity and took it? Or was she something else? A catalyst? A strange, dark force that didn't create the cracks in their perfect life, but merely held a magnifying glass to them until the heat of the truth set the entire structure on fire. The story was over, but the haunting would last forever.